Okay, so we're going to start, and I know there'll be other people joining us along the way. I'm Liz Hume. I'm the acting CEO of the Alliance for Peace Building. So welcome to this really critical session. This is part of our U.S. peace building session that we have every Wednesday. And we've touched topics from what are the conflict drivers to violent extremism in the U.S., we've named it, we've done it, and the session will continue on through July. It was originally scheduled only for a couple of weeks, but the response was overwhelming, and clearly, as Peter Coleman, who I'll introduce in a second, said in the book, there are numerous issues driving instability in the U.S., and not one of them is the key cause. And he'll get to that a little bit more, but let me first introduce Peter and tell you, first of all, the first time I actually met you was on a call 6-7 months ago on the Horizons Project. And I heard Peter speak and I said, I got to meet this guy and I got to know what he's doing because he's brilliant. And so I did. I reached out to him, and I'm really excited that he has his new book out, The Way Out. I unfortunately don't have a pretty cover to show you because I have it on my Kindle, but maybe he can show you the cover. It's actually kind of cool. So let me just tell you a little bit about Peter Coleman. He's a professor of psychology and education at Columbia University. He holds joint appointment at Teachers College and the Earth Institute and directs 2 research centers. He is the author of Making Conflict Work, Harnessing the Power of Disagreement in 2014, and The 5%, Finding Solutions to Seemingly Impossible Conflicts, 2011, and now this book. So I just want to say a couple things. He's going to talk about his book, and then we'll have an interactive question and answer session. It starts out, well, first of all, buy the book. And I actually told him before, I have it on a Kindle. Otherwise, you would see yellow highlights and notes in the sections. Unfortunately, I have to do the notes, but in the Kindle. But it starts off as Rome burns. And I have thought about that so many times because many of us are conflict resolution experts who have worked all over the world. And you've kind of seen the slow boil pot, and it hasn't been since 2016. It's before that. And so, he starts off, we are destabilized, we are shaken. And I think he captures it so brilliantly. I'm not going to give away the book. I'll let him talk it through because he'll do it much more justice than I do. I just want to say when he, in the first section, when he's talking about what's happening in Boston, and the violence there around the abortion clinics. I was there in college in the 80s. I was at Boston College, and I remember that so vividly, and had no idea how things calmed down. So it was news to me to see that. So anyway, with that, I'm going to let Peter take it away. Thank you for this work, this timely work that is so critical in our nation's history. So thank you.
Liz, thank you. Hopefully I'm not muted. Yes, I think I'm good. And as usual, it's surreal to not be with you all, but be speaking with you all on Zoom. I wrote this book, The Way Out, over the last couple of years, although I've worked on it for the past 25 years on the science and research behind it. And this talk is part of a series of conversations that I've been fortunate enough to have with Shamal Idris at Search for Common Ground, and John Haidt and John Paul Lederach last week, and Liz Hume this week, where I've been able to present some of the ideas from the book and then engage in conversation with others. So I'm looking forward to it. I'm going to share a screen, share some slides, as I'm known to do. Right, so I direct this center at Columbia, which is the Morton Deutsch International Center for Cooperation and Conflict Resolution, and it was founded by Mort Deutsch in the mid-'80s, and it really is a an attempt to keep science and practice as closely in dialogue as possible. Mort was a student of Kurt Lewin, who believed in that. Mort believed in it and really indoctrinated his followers, his students, with that idea. And so what we try to do is do research on problems that practitioners have and try to advance methods through the use of science as much as possible. And one of the areas I work in is in the area of more protracted intractable conflicts, and I've written a few books on that. And in order to do research on those kinds of conflicts, we built what we call a capture lab at Columbia, which is a small space where we can bring in disputants and have real-time, real conversations, and then track their emotional, cognitive, behavioral, attitudinal dynamics as they change over time. And so we've done a lot of research on this for about 20 years with this lab and other labs, and have published a lot of it in journals and some textbooks, and then have tried to translate it most recently into English, right, into language that human beings that are in the midst of these kinds of problems can use, read and learn from. And the Way Out is the latest application of this paradigm of thinking to toxic polarization, to long-term patterns of escalating polarization. And I became interested in writing this book probably right after Donald Trump was elected. And because I run this lab, the Difficult Conversations Lab, my work was getting some attention, and I was approached by some groups that were interested in doing some kind of bridge building work that were making good faith attempts at bringing people together. This is one of them. This is an initiative called My Country Talks, started as Germany Talks, initiated by a group called Die Zeit, which is a periodical in Germany, and then it grew to other media organizations. And this is an initiative where you can go to their website, you answer a series of questions that on polarizing issues, and then they match you with someone in your area and encourage you to either go off and have a conversation or go on Zoom and have a conversation with them. This is based on contact theory, which many of you are familiar with. The idea is that when members of groups don't know each other, having human contact, having face-to-face contact can start to lower the temperature on vilification if it's happening, and lead to some kinds of transformations. And I think that's largely the case, except what we've started to see in this era with, for example, pro-Trump and anti-Trump activists or believers, is that getting people together seems to not have the effect that it does under certain conditions, right? And so I was concerned that the science behind contact theory that's been going on for 50 or 60 years and other intergroup relations kinds of research was not sufficiently informing the practice that bridge builders, some of the bridge builders were employing and using in their practice. And when I pushed some of these folks from My Country Talks, they shared with me some of the catastrophes, some of the backfires that were happening, such as this one, when they came here, met a Trump voter supporter and an anti-Trumper, and the journalist Bastian Bergner met them, followed them, reported on them for over about a year, and eventually, really became to befriend them and respect them, and so brought them together in New York City for a couple of conversations, which went very well until he actually raised the issue of Colin Kaepernick, and things exploded into, as he said, F-bombs. The men stormed out and they refused to have any contact with him or them going forward. And this is my concern. And my concern is that under certain conditions where you have deep, passionate, true believers on an issue or on what is bigger than an issue, which is a culture, just encouraging people to get together and talk is unethical, let alone ineffective, particularly when these are the people that you're trying to bring together, which are from the streets of our nation. So I wrote this book as an attempt to summarize what empirical science tells us can help with this kind of polarization, this manifestation of what I call toxic polarization. So what I'm going to talk to you briefly about first is what is that? What is toxic polarization? How does it differ from other kinds of polarization? And then a little bit about why we're stuck in this 50, 60-year trajectory of increasingly intense escalation of polarization. And then mostly what the book focuses on is what to do about it. There's a lot of good work out there now summarizing the problems. So we have a good academic sense of what the problems are, much less about therefore what do we do? And so that's really what this book focuses on. Let me just start by saying that polarization is not a bad thing, it's just a thing. It's a thing in science, right? It's a phenomenon you see when you have sort of two opposing poles that organize an energy system around them and therefore, you know, attract and repel certain elements within that system. So this is something that, you know, has been in physics and magnetism research for a year, you know, a century and a half. So we know a fair amount about this. And it's just a natural thing. And in politics, it's not a bad thing. In a two-party system like ours, you need sufficient distance between the parties in their beliefs and their ideas and their take on good governance. And you want passionate, smart people that are challenging one another to serve as a check and balance. Some of you know in the late 1950s, our two-party system was too cozy and there's too much overlapping and people were starting to call for a need for more separation. So polarization isn't the problem. What is the problem is what I refer to as toxic polarization. And let me just give you a taste of some of the trends associated with that. One of the more concerning trends, one of the things that's measured most is affective polarization, this increasing spike in how we feel towards members of their group and how they feel towards members of us, the degree of coldness. And we've seen this again spike over the past several decades, really from the 1970s. To a point today where you have Republicans and Democrats in the 80%, really feeling highly unfavorable, feeling the other side is cold, unintelligent, selfish, and actively trying to hurt the country. And so that's obviously a concerning indicator, on top of the fact that our thinking about the more complex issues that our nation faces becomes much more simplistic and tribal over time. Pew Research Foundation measures a thing called ideological consistency. They measure 10 divisive issues: immigration, gay rights, environmentalism, and they look over time at how much those attitudes on those issues within party start to correlate. So people that hold one position hold them all in ways that are consistent with their party position, and how far the parties start to come apart. And so what that means is that across these 10 highly complicated issues, we start to not really pay attention or think clearly or critically on these issues. We really start to follow the lead of our leaders, right, or our team, which of course isn't a considerable concern under our current conditions where the world is becoming increasingly more complicated and we're paying less attention. But you also see collapses in our identities. You see fusion of ideological, religious, racial, and political identities within teams, within tribes, increases in perceptual distortion. More in Common has been studying this, and they see that the other side, we view the other side as having more extreme attitudes than they actually do, which of course stimulates in us responses that are in kind. You see the oversized effect of more extreme voices on Twitter. Something like 80% of the content is contributed by about 10% of the users, and they're the most actively engaged and oftentimes the most extreme voices that are driving the discourse. And then two of the more concerning patterns are the sorting that you see, the geographical and virtual sorting of us, right? So you see reds and blues moving away from the other group and towards their own group, not only in terms of the rural-urban split, but also within cities. The Times recently, New York Times published a couple of pieces where they show these clusters within towns, within cities. Here, this is where I am right now on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, in the sea of blue. They also point out that 7 miles away across the river, there's a town, there's a county that has about 50-50 Republicans and Democrats. So you still see that in some places, but you're seeing this kind of sorting, physical sorting, moving away from one another all over the country, including in urban areas, which should be a major consideration, because this need for contact and cross-cutting structures where people grow up together is a critical mitigator of intergroup violence, and we're losing those capacities. And then finally, as an outcome of a lot of these other indicators, you see rises in hate groups, hate crimes, and political violence. White nationalist groups grew 55% in the Trump era. You see spikes in this in cities around the world. And then, of course, you see political violence happening in our nation's capital on January 6th, and the prediction, the probability that much more of that will follow. So these are the conditions we're in, and this is what we call toxic polarization. This is a kind of polarization that makes us sick. We see increases in anxiety and depression, suicidal ideation. We feel more alienated from our neighbors and oftentimes our family members. But this is not new. This is something that has a long trajectory. So this is Nolan McCarty's work looking at voting patterns in Congress since 1879. And these days, today, we are at a point where we are more polarized in terms of, bipartisan voting in Congress than we were after the US Civil War. But this trend has also been happening since the mid to late 1970s. So this is a long-term problem, and it has today reached, as we know, almost total deadlock with very few exceptions in Congress. So one of the things I did when I started to write this book is I looked carefully into the empirical science that tries to characterize what are the factors that contribute to us being stuck. And if you look at it, there are many. There are, micro factors, differences in values, differences in the sensitivity of our brains to threat between progressives and conservatives. Conservatives are found to have more threat-sensitive brains and therefore be more vulnerable to certain kinds of messaging from their leaders. But basically ethnocentric processes, authoritarianism, all of these factors are contributors to this pattern, as are a lot of the macro structural factors, like the simple fact that we have these two-party winner-takes-all political systems, which forces us to make these tribal choices around some of our most consequential choices. But you also see internet sorting, and you see the media ecosystems that have grown up. So there are many structural factors. And part of the point I made that Liz mentioned earlier on, that I make in the book, is that none of these account for a 50, 60-year trajectory of the kinds of polarization we're seeing. What does account for them is how they start to feed each other, how these different pieces start to align in ways that become bigger than us. They become bigger than just me changing my attitudes or behaviors or skills. There are, a series of different factors that start to feed each other that create these systems, these highly complex systems that, are like addiction, are a biopsychosocial structural problem. They get in our neurological systems, in our brain systems, they get in our relationships, in our psychology, they get in our families, in our communities, who we see and don't see, hang out with and don't hang out with, who we marry and who we don't, so they affect our communities, and then they scale up and are affected by the national discourse. So you have a series of factors that start to align in strange ways to really pull us apart. That's the kind of problem that we're in, and this is a problem that Karl Popper, who was a philosopher of science, referred to as cloud problems. So Popper made a distinction in the 60s where he said science, or the world, humans face two kinds of problems. One are called clock problems, which, like clocks, if it's broken, you can take it apart, you can find the broken piece, repair it, put it back together. These are mechanical, predictable, controllable kinds of problems. And then you have cloud problems. So these are infinite, changing, unpredictable, very hard to control problems. And we are, in our left brain world, much more comfortable and inclined and celebrate, and interested in tackling clock problems. But when you apply clock tools to cloud problems, you cause more problems. And this, of course, is a cloud problem. So what I talk about in the book is how do these things, these different elements, start to align in ways that create these strong bipolar patterns like this. This is an image from Twitter. It shows you how red communication within the red Twitter sphere and blue communication within the blue Twitter sphere tends to become rumination, dysphoric rumination within these two groups. That means that there is, like what we call in our field autistic hostility, right? We know what they're like. We don't really need to communicate with them. So we talk and ruminate on our side, and they talk and ruminate on their side, and you get these two stains, right? These two images that are two closed systems with very little contact, which is a very dangerous kind of dynamic to see. You see this also in voting in Congress. This is since 1949, and there used to be much more gray and connectivity up here. And today you see, and this is 2011, you see these kinds of distinctions. And you even see it in the media, the more mainstream media sphere, where you see this kind of sorting take place. So what happens when these different elements, our leaders in Washington, ourselves, our families, the media we watch, or start to align and organize as they create these patterns that are similar to addiction. They're patterns that we fall into. They're very difficult not to fall into. So let me give you just a quicker thought experiment about how this is. I walk you through this in the book. But imagine you're at a diner. You're sitting at your favorite diner for breakfast, and in walks some dude, and this person sits down next to you, which is fine, right? You're doing fine. You're glad to be here. But suddenly he puts his arm up against your arm. And, again, typically doesn't matter, but it's a little odd because there's a lot of space there. And he's chosen to sit down next to you and kind of splay out and make contact with you. So you sit and wait for a minute, and then you start to notice what he orders and how he treats the waitress and his kind of overall attitude and air and how he's dressed. And what starts to happen is different beliefs and feelings and attitudes start to coalesce into a little bit of a grudge that you feel towards this person. And then you start to sort of express, not even saying anything, but kind of start to express your frustration. And he picks up on that. And now you have this kind of two-person system of conflict that has shaped. And you haven't even spoken to each other yet, right? You've just been sitting there. And this is the beginning. And then over time, he comes back and he starts to kind of befriend others who sort of become cool to you, and you do the same, and you develop these kind of camps. And then lo and behold, it turns out that he is a fan of a different political party, maybe of a different race or religion than you. And so you have those differences that you see that start to become meaningful. And over time, these things start to feed each other, and they create the conditions where we can't really tolerate members of our group having contact with them and vice versa. And we start to sort in these ways that I've been describing. These are these patterns, these intractable conflict, these protracted conflict patterns that are so hard to change. Because typically when we try to change them by bringing people together to talk, we're focusing on that moment, that issue, that relationship, and trying to just change how they communicate. The landscape of their lives are created by all these other factors that just draw us in, much like an addiction. So this is where I describe in the book the need to change our theory of change. And this is back to Popper, because Popper would say, we are enamored with the idea that we can fix anything. We can fix a conflict, right? We can sort of go in, identify the problem, isolate it, address it, and that will help solve the problem. But in systems like this, that doesn't help. And so we need to start to check our theory of change and perhaps identify an alternative way to think about and work with these kinds of problems, which I lay out in the book. So let me just say a couple other things and then I'll stop for questions. And that is, there is some good news in the context of this long-term, seemingly intractable dynamic that we're stuck in. And this comes from the study of societies that have long-term divisions that actually do change, and the conditions under which they decide to pivot. And there are a couple of basic conditions. One from ripeness theory is that you need to have enough folks on both sides that are fed up, that are exhausted, and really want something different. And the good news there is that we are. America is miserable. The More in Common group, again, has identified somewhere between 86 and 93% of America is fed up with the dysfunction. We're looking for a different way to engage. Many of them in the middle are disengaged. So you have this critical mass that are fed up, and you have another condition, which is a stabilization of the status quo. One of the things that they've studied in terms of international war is many of the longer term wars end within a decade of major destabilizing shocks, assassinations, coup attempts, the end of the Cold War. When you have major instability, those are the times, or health crisis in your family, or you lose a job. There are times when we pause and we start to reflect on our basic assumptions. And so these conditions create tremendous opportunities for a society like ours to pivot and reset. But what the third condition that is necessary is that we have to have a clear sense of how to do that. What is the way out? What are the steps forward? And so that's what this book offers. What I've done in this book is identify 5 areas of science that suggest that there are things that you can do today. It's not a series of steps, it's just a different series of modes that you can operate in, that you can translate into very practical things to do in your life, in your family, in your community, or at a national level, that can help us find a way out of this. And so I'll finish with giving you a taste of these things. So the first one is, again, capture new systems or new beginnings, and try to reset. And like addicts, oftentimes when they hit bottom, they need to pivot. And the first things that they do, the first people they choose to be with or not be with, the first places they choose to go to or not go to, are very powerful determinants of what happens next. And so, for example, one of the early conditions that you want to be mindful of are your assumptions about change, particularly about them. Do you think, if you're an anti-Trumper, do you think that those pro-Trumpers are ever going to change? Are their attitudes or not, right? But our assumptions about that matters. And this is research by Aaron Halperin and others that have looked in the Middle East about the power of those simple assumptions. If Israelis believe the Palestinians will never change, the situation will never change, and in fact, will never change, then they either disengage from the conflict, or when they're in it, they fight. But if you believe there's a possibility that some members of the other side are willing to have a different kind of conversation or a different kind of relationship, then you might engage in a different way. And so simply checking that assumption, not alone, right, because it's a simple nudge, but it's something to be mindful of when you enter into and engage the first time across the divide. So do you believe that they can change? All right, so that's one taste of what I talk about in the first chapter on resetting. The second is the fact that in patterns like this, in, again, addiction, in intractable, dysfunctional families or communities, what oftentimes we do is come in with fixes. The international community will show up, or bridge builders from the outside will show up. And what we oftentimes miss doing is identifying what's already working, right? Who's already effectively doing this? And this is what we call positive deviance. And there are many examples of bridge building groups in this country today. Many of them are probably on the line today or on Zoom today, that are doing good work, that it's informed by science, and it's careful, and it's mindful of the kinds of context we're in, and that these aren't easy, quick conversations, that they really need to be facilitated, transformative, they take time, and ideally they move into action. So if you go to, this is an initiative out of Princeton, the Bridging Divides initiative, and what they are in the process of doing is mapping across the US what is currently, I think, approximately 7,000 groups and organizations across the country that are doing this work. And so you can go there and find where you live and what exists there in order to address this. So this again is about the fact that oftentimes systems, communities, families can heal themselves under the right conditions, and if the people that are the peacemakers or the groups that are already doing this work are sufficiently recognized and supported and encouraged. It is about recognizing the immune system of communities that already exists and working with them. And there's a lot of research, as some of you know, in international peace building about the critical importance of identifying local actors and local initiatives in order to really affect sustainable peace as opposed to temporary fixes. So there's a lot more to say about that, but that is what that principle is, and that chapter goes into. Complicate comes from our work on the Difficult Conversations Lab, but others work as well. And this is the simple idea that under conditions where life becomes simple, they're crazy, we're victims of their insanity, and it's clear, you know, it's sort of a good and evil dynamic. That's when you need to introduce a sense of doubt, a sense of contradiction. You need to recomplicate your life. And so in this chapter, I give various examples at different levels of how this occurs. One is in journalism. So this is my colleague, Amanda Ripley, who some of you may know. I think she gave a book talk here a week or two ago, but she had come to our lab and studied mediation, and she was interested in communicating to journalists what they could do in their approach to reporting to not contribute to polarization and to perhaps help mitigate it. And the piece is called Complicating the Narratives, because the typical business model of mainstream media and reporting these days is find a hot conflict, find two sides, you know, that are far apart, that are compelling stories, and that's the clickbait that the industry is built on. And so what she's encouraging reporters to reflect on is alternative ways of doing that, that hold on to the nuance and complication of these stories and still make them sufficiently compelling. So it is recognizing the structural drivers of the media in how they present the news and the business model behind that as a contributor, but ways to start to complicate that and open that up. And I similarly talk about this in terms of just cross-cutting structures, right? So these are what we're losing as people move away from each other, is this need to have people have contact. And in this piece on the Hill a couple years ago, I wrote about when Newt Gingrich changed the work week in Congress in the mid-90s from 5 days to 3 days, and said to his Republican colleagues, don't move here, keep your families in your home states. You can raise more money there, and I don't want you fraternizing with this other side. And in doing so, what he did intentionally or unintentionally, was remove the kinds of social context that Congress people had when their children grew up together in the same neighborhood and went to school together and played sports, et cetera, right? So that's now decades long, where that kind of structure of not necessarily making the best friendships, but just having a humanizing effect of having your children growing up together was surgically removed. And we've seen some of the consequences today. So again, this chapter builds on that premise and the need to complicate our lives. And then two other things I'll say, but one of it is that this is something that I think is missing in most of the work and a lot of our work in our field. In conflict resolution, mediation, and dialogue groups, we oftentimes bring disputants from different poles together, have them sit down at a table face to face and talk it out. And what this misses is the simple fact that humans grew our nuanced and complex brains and abilities to problem solve when we were, you know, traversing together in small groups across the Sahel, foraging and doing hunting and gathering together. That's a dynamic that we're missing out on in our in some of our peace building work. And what the recent research on neuroscience is suggesting is that's a critical factor sometimes when the conflict becomes embodied in our neurological structures, then we do need some kind of jolt, some kind of synchronization with the other, and having people get up and walk and move, ideally outside, face to face with one another, is one way to start to build that kind of synchrony, which fosters compassion, empathy, some degree of cooperation. It's a physiological reaction to movement together that we can build on in order to find peace. And this group, the Abraham Path Initiative, which some of you know, Bill Urey and his colleagues set this up, is an example of this, where they bring folks from different religious denominations to walk the trek that Abraham made with his family. And it's both a social economic development initiative and a peace building initiative of having people move and walk together. But this is also existing in other cities. These kinds of initiatives have taken place across this country as well. And then the final thing I'll say, is that when you're dealing with complex problems, there is oftentimes the unintentional consequences of well-intentioned acts. We'll try to do something, we'll support something, encourage something, and it will, again, like the folks at My Country Talks, backfire. And so it's critical that we learn to learn about our mistakes and our failures. And that's some of this advice comes from Dietrich Dorner's book called The Logic of Failure, which came out in the mid-90s, where he studied well-intentioned decision makers in complex problems, complex environments, and oftentimes the well-intentioned acts that they introduce would backfire, and they would need to, in order to do no harm and help the communities thrive, they would need to make serious adjustments. And so this is an adaptive form of decision-making and problem-solving that, again, is not terribly familiar to all of us. We usually like to analyze the plan and go in with the plan and stick to it if possible. But we've done research on this. This is the peacemaker game. And Nick Redding, a former student of mine, and I did some work on this, where we looked at some of the competencies that contributed to people being able to play this game. This is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and to play it long enough that you could basically, keep political will on both sides sufficiently high that it didn't break out into war or you didn't get thrown out of office. And so there are competencies about our cognitive complexity, our ability to hold contradictory emotions, to think in short and long-term time spans. There are some basic competencies that we can develop in order to become more adaptive decision makers. So the book culminates in this set of new rules that I won't go into, but they try to take these principles and the discussion of how they translate into practice into what you could do in your life today. If you find yourself trapped, the first thing you want to do is see that other people are finding a way out. And these nudges can help us, but in order to read them, you'll have to either go to the website or read the book, ideally the latter, and I will stop there and open it up to questions or to Liz. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much. Okay, so much to go into, and I see that there are questions popping in, but
great.
The one thing I wanted to ask, and it's something you and I talked about before, first of all, before I say that, I just want to remind everybody, we have a session after this on elections, and a lot of good work that the Carter Center has done, and that's why the title is, having free and fair elections and safe elections isn't just about election day. We have to be working on it all year round. So some really good speakers there talking about some of the work they did in the last election and also in Georgia. So please tune in for that. So the one part that I think is really fascinating, you talk about this culminating moment, right? Like something that's destabilizing. And we did see that here in the US. I mean, this global pandemic and the way it was raging through the United States, I say we are incredibly lucky that the vaccine came out, because but for that, we have the ability to pay for it and to distribute it. But for that, I can't even imagine how many more hundreds of thousands of Americans would be dead. But what we didn't see is the US come together. In fact, it got even more polarized and weaponized. And how do we account for that? You know, it's like, if we're miserable and we had this moment, why did we lose it?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. Yeah, so what you're describing, of course, is what we call disaster diplomacy, right? When awful things happen to communities, a tsunami hits, you'll see groups that are warring groups put down their arms and help rebuild the society. And that is what many of us expected to take place in the US and should have. And it speaks to what a first order problem our polarization is, because when things like COVID become weaponized for political gain, when the wildfires on the West Coast become weaponized for political gain, it speaks to the profound influence of politics in our perception of the world and the media and how it's reshaped, right? So it's a phenomenon that does usually happen and didn't happen here, mostly because it was weaponized as part of political fodder at the time. So it's all the more reason to pay close attention to this underlying structural problem that we have, because obviously we're not going to be saved by these other kinds of crises. I mean, climate change is a crisis, inequality is a crisis, racial injustice is a crisis. We have these multiple, extraordinary crises that we're facing, and we can't even come together on the fact that 90% of Americans support background checks on purchases of new guns, because we can't come together. Let me say one thing though, is many of you probably know this, but last week the Senate did actually pass a bipartisan bill. It passed a bipartisan bill supporting investment in technological infrastructure in this country because they're terrified of China, right? China owns that game. And so having, in that particular instance, that is enough of a threat and enough of a bipartisan threat to bring Congress together to actually vote in a bipartisan way on a bill, which was a fairly extraordinary thing. So oftentimes external threats like that do operate to bring us together. It was extraordinary that it didn't around COVID.
Well, and why did that happen? Because we had an extraordinary event. That pipeline that was moving gas got hacked. Yeah. And, you saw, I mean, were we going to run out of gas? I mean, I don't know what happened in New York City, but here outside of Washington, D.C. and Falls Church and all around this area, you couldn't get gas. You would go to gas stations and it would be, we're out of gas, and you'd see long lines. And, that's just not something Americans are used to. I think that was the shock.
Yeah.
So
it was a wake-up call, I think. I mean, I think the concern around the growth of China, but particularly around tech and this, becoming a bipolar tech world, is making, Washington nuts. So it is a threat, and it's a real threat that was sufficiently mobilizing. And in some ways, at least it's promising that they came together on that, because even that could have been insufficient.
100%. Okay, let's get to some of these questions. One of the questions is, and I agree with this question, do you think that referring to groups by red and blue and presenting as these two-sided contributes to the toxic polarization?
Yeah, probably. I mean, certainly to some degree. I know that More in Common has been very careful to talk about 7 tribes, right? They talk about the difference between the extreme wings and the more middle moderate groups. And I think that's important. Look, this book is aimed, is dedicated to the 85% of Americans that are exhausted, fed up, and want a different way out. And that's who I'm trying to reach out to. And yes, so some of the parlance of of describing things in red and blue is definitely part of the problem, and I'm certainly susceptible to that. But it's how people understand the problem right now.
No, agreed. Okay, let me get to some of the other questions. It'd be helpful if someone could provide it. There was the perceptual distortions that you were talking about, the study.
Yeah.
If you could just give a little bit more.
That came from?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a study, again, by More in Common. So if you go to More in Common, it is an organization that does research and activism on depolarization in different parts of the world, but also in America. They did a recent report on Texas that was focused specifically there. But this was a study that came out probably in 2019. I think maybe it was 2020, where they were looking purely at perception of the other. And they found, you know, that our perceptions of the other side are much more extreme than they actually are, right? And that goes in both directions. So it is from more in common.
Okay, and Theo, who works with us on these issues here at the Alliance for Peace Building, pointed out that the Senate yesterday also unanimously passed a resolution to recognize Juneteenth as a federal holiday. Not a high bar, but it's something, it's a start. So, okay. Based on your findings, what advice would you give to improve more contact theory-based initiatives? And I have to say, you started off by saying, you know, good intentions, some are incredibly just unethical, and they are making the problem worse. And so this is a really critical issue. And you know, it's about adapting and being able to say, okay, in my brain, this would work. Doesn't mean it's going to work on other people.
Yeah. So again, we know, you know, contact theory and how to do that effectively has been studied for decades. And it's not just about bringing people together. I mean, sometimes under some conditions, that is the issue, that there's just no understanding or information about the other side. But when you have heated disputes, such as we have, and all these other factors, this isn't helpful. You know, the conditions that matter for contact theory to work is that you have to have equal status groups, which of course never exists, right?
Right.
Who come together face to face, who ideally are pursuing some kind of superordinate goal or superordinate understanding. Those are usually the conditions. But again, when you have different sets of facts, different, you know, deep passions, and you have some degree these like cult-like behaviors, these are not the conditions for this to work. Let me give you an alternative. So there's an initiative happening right now. So this man named Dave Isay founded a group called StoryCorps, which some of the folks will be familiar with. It's an NPR initiative that captures stories. It's been around for decades. And they've been starting an initiative over the past 2 years, 2.5 years, called One Small Step. And what they're trying to do is use StoryCorps as a methodology to bring people across the political divide together in conversation. But what they do in some ways is the opposite of what many of us do in contact, which is that they, first of all, they recognize that because they're NPR associated, the left knows them, the right's not interested, so they're very proactive. They've been piloting this in 4 cities, and they're very proactive at reaching out to right-wing media to get buy-in on the process and sharing of the content, and then to ultimately be able to recruit folks. And when they bring people together, what they do is they have them do a couple of things. And just for full disclosure, I've been on what Dave calls his brain trust for the past 6-8 months, helping them think through some of the science and the implications for what they do. And they've been very adaptive in what they do. Because originally the idea was, well, let's bring them together and have them talk about an issue. And ultimately what they do is the opposite of that. They have them, you know, if you're interested, you go to their website, you fill out a form where you write about your story. Who are you? What's important to you? Where did you come from? Where did you grow up? So you share your story, and then you check certain aspects of your life right now. Have you had a recent loss in your life? Have you had a child recently? Did you just lose your job? So they check on those things. And then they match people not on a divisive issue because they know that they're politically divided. They match them on what they have in common. And then they bring them together, and the first thing they say to them is, we don't want you to talk about politics. We want you to talk to each other. Let's start by you telling my story, and I tell your story, and then take it from there. And so they've kind of flipped the paradigm of contact to be about being a human. And the fact that, yes, I lost my brother and you lost your father to COVID. That's an extraordinary thing to talk about. And so it tries to move people into a human space where they connect on a deeper level. And they have these conversations for 40 minutes. And then they have all kinds of guardrails. If, you know, they can leave the conversation at any time. When the conversation is done, they can choose to either share it only with StoryCorps, share it more broadly, you know, and share it with the public, or not share it at all, right? So they built in the psychological safety and a process of encounter that is, to me, very smart and intentional, and recognizes that you're not going to get into build a wall or not build a wall and come to any understanding of that in 40 minutes that's meaningful, right? There's just too much to unpack there. So they try to move people right into their own humanity and the humanity of the other. So we know a lot about this, and we know what not to do. And many of these groups on this call, I'm sure, are informed by that science. I get concerned when people aren't. They take the low-hanging fruit of let's just throw people together, and I think that's a mistake.
No, I can't agree more. And we have to, in the peace building community, have to come up with standards. So a couple questions, I'm just going to pull them all out. How do you scale this? Also, someone talked about bringing in the arts, how important that is. And how do you deal with intergenerational trauma? I mean, we know the brain, it's in our DNA. And I just want to say one other thing too. I picked up psychology today last week when I was in the CBS, and you can't see that. It's exactly what you said. It's about storytelling is good for us and our bodies. It lowers stress, increases empathy, and that is, if you're trying to teach, it's the best way to, I was just writing it down, teach, persuade, and understand ourselves.
Yeah.
So psychology today agrees with you.
Well, good to hear. Although I welcome disagreement, I think that's really important that we figure out how to disagree in agreeable ways. So the scaling issue, again, in this book, so here's the book, just so you see it. What I've tried to do in this book is identify these 5 principles from science that have different kinds of research affiliated with them. And then mostly what I talk about in each chapter is how do you do that? How could you do that in your life today? How might you do that in your family? How might you do that in your community? What kind of media do you want to be looking for? So what I attempt to do in this book is talk at different levels about the implications of these different principles, right? So in that way, I try to walk the reader through how this could scale and how you could enact this in different ways in your life. You know, I'm also in conversations with different groups about taking something like, I mean, you know, what I'm clear about is that there are not simple solutions to this. This does require a commitment. It does require a rethinking of the problem, and it does require time, right? I mean, one of the, I think, most powerful examples that I give in the book is an example from Waterton, New York, which is from a story that Amanda Ripley told in an Atlantic article in 2019, I think, about one of the most politically tolerant counties in America. And we've actually just gone back and done a study of the 1% of counties that are the most politically tolerant in comparison to the 1% that are the least, to see what distinguishes them. And we published that in The Hill last week. And what I wanted to say is, what you find in these places is not like these momentary encounters. You find places where there are mixed partisan marriages, right? That there's 25% of the marriages in this county are mixed partisan. And you have places where people come together, either religious organizations or just like there was a reverend that would do a Monday breakfast, and he would invite people from different political persuasions together, and they would meet every Monday, and he would cook them breakfast, very important. They would eat and talk, and he said, and what we do is we talk about an issue long enough that we all start to realize the things we don't know. That's what happened. And that doesn't happen in a 1 hour cup of coffee with somebody else if you start with the wall, right? You don't get there, right? these things take time. The relational components of these kinds of dialogues take time. And in fact, you know, Liz mentioned the Boston women's dialogue that I start the book with, which was a clandestine process that took place because of the violence and their concerns about their reputations that took place. And it took them 5.5 years of secret dialogue before they came out publicly. So it was a difficult, grindingly difficult process that took a lot of time, but that ultimately was highly influential and had second and third order effects on the community, and they think on the ethos around abortion in America.
Well, yes. Okay, arts and the intergenerational trauma.
Yeah, so arts absolutely are, and again, as you suggest, stories and storytelling is the essence of many dialogue processes, right? It is me sharing who I am and you sharing who you are, and us recognizing and hearing each other. Those are highly transformational, and so any kind of modality that can do that, I think, can stick. I mean, the challenge is, of course, there's a need for so much activism around many of the challenges that we have. And so there's a lot of energy for that kind of art, which makes sense, and we do need. And we need energy in recognizing the humanity of each other. I would love to see an exhibit that does both, right? That takes the advocacy positions that we need to hear and navigate through, and you know, ends up in a session or in a series of pieces of work that really are about what we share as human beings. I think that would be a sort of fantastic experience, and I could see it in a gallery, right? So intergenerational trauma is part of the problem here. I mean, when we talk about, you know, race and white supremacy as an underlying component of the divisions that exist today and of what is often weaponized by certain leaders in order to mobilize their base, it taps into intergenerational trauma. So intergenerational trauma exists. It is a wellspring of both pain and political motivation to mobilize people, and it's oftentimes weaponized, right? And that's, again, part of the context or the landscape that we're all in, and that we need to at least find safeguards that avoid or ways to push back on those that kind of weaponization. A lot more to say about that, but I see that we have 10 seconds left, so.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you. This is a phenomenal book. Buy it. You know, it's not a one and done. It's a one and go back to, and, you know, highlight and write notes in it. This is a phenomenal book, and it's what our country needs right now. So I cannot thank you for your work and for what you're doing. And I'm just glad I mean, I knew of you, but I'm glad I heard you that day and your brilliance and said, I need to talk to this guy. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
We're grateful.
Thank you. I appreciate the platform. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.